What do minorities bring to the innovation table that the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Elon Musks, who are clearly very talented, miss? Why is it so important to invest in minorities when it comes to innovation and entrepreneurship, of reinventing America?
Look, we bring itches that need to be scratched, that millions of people have, and that there's real markets. But at the same time, you know what's interesting? I have never seen a pitch from a black male entrepreneur that did not have a social impact built into it. That, you know, that we also sort of bring just who we are, if you will, as a people. We have entrepreneurs who, they started off, their itch was they wanted to send money to their grandmother, for instance, in the Dominican Republic, and not have Western Union take 30%. They wanted to send money to grandma in the Dominican Republic, and they wanted to not have her be a mark when she walks out of that storefront with the plate glass window and everybody knows she has money in her pocket, and have her get mugged. And so they figured out ways to actually, you know, transfer dollars to the DR that she can get it right on her cell phone, and can spend it on, you know, important bills. It's a company called Regali, and it's a fraction of what it will cost you to do it through Western Union. The reality is that genius is resident equally in every zip code in our country. I mean, when you look at the children, kids come into this world perfect. We damage them, right? What I really do with our young people is push them to think big. And one of the toughest things as an investor is to have an entrepreneur of color, black or Latino entrepreneur, come in with a great idea, but who have literally been conditioned. It really probably is a strategy for survival, you know, by their parents, for instance, who may have been small business people, to sort of dream without credit, right? To keep their dreams about this big. When they're walking into the context of the Silicon Valley, where there are millions of dollars to be invested sort of every day, just pouring into the valley, and to say to them, we can't invest in you, not because you have a great idea or you're not qualified, but because your idea isn't big enough, and even though we've asked you a battery of questions, your brain isn't willing to let go and just dream.
Ben, I know you're on the board of the AT&T Accelerator program. What is it about older companies like AT&T that perhaps make them slightly friendlier to minority entrepreneurs than some of these new companies in the Valley?
Well, I mean, part of it, right, is that a company like AT&T is completely connected into the, sort of the fabric of our entire country. And they, quite frankly, benefit, for instance, from relationships with historically black colleges. And they benefit from people, you know, decades ago taking the risk to actually create an internal culture that was more welcoming and more supportive of, for instance, of promotion of women and people of color up the ranks. And one of the hardest things in the Valley is that this new generation of tech companies is worse off as far as inclusion than the companies that were just 20 years older, than the HPs, you know, of the world, or the Lotuses of the world. At the same time, what makes me optimistic is that our country really is, the two biggest tech regions are the one around the San Francisco Bay and the one around the Chesapeake Bay, the so-called BWI Dulles corridor. Well, while black programmers are like 2-3% of the programmers around the San Francisco Bay, we're 18% of the programmers around the Chesapeake Bay. And that has to do, again, with legacy companies, defense industry companies, deciding 20, 30, 40 years ago to go to HBCUs and say, in 5 years, this is what we're going to need. And so let's start producing that now. We're just starting to see Google get to Morehouse and things like that, starting to have that conversation. It gives me hope that we can actually move faster than what their track record to date might suggest is possible. You know, from historically disadvantaged, presently disadvantaged backgrounds, we don't just look for blacks and Latinos, if that's the shorthand. We look for Hmong, we look for Vietnamese, we look for Filipino. And I'm saying that there are specific Asian subsets that are locked out, and there are ones that are let in, right? And when you're from California, one thing that you understand is there's also a difference whether you come from a fifth generation family or a first generation family. I mean, there's all sorts of things there. You know, my hope is when you look at these young people coming up, is that they're kind of less, sort of both more eager for change and less encumbered by the old lines of division. And that they're, at the end of the day, you know, that's sort of why the crisis of the Silicon Valley is so important. Because, you know, you're sitting there in this old farming community where race and place were very much connected, right? If you were Chicano or if you were Chinese in Silicon Valley 100 years ago, it had specific implications, right? If you were Japanese and you were there 67 years ago, they were taking your farm from you, right? Well, they're sending you off to an internment camp. And so then you bring in the technology of the future, and yet we still find ourselves with these, with these old barriers being re-erected, where blacks are locked out and Latinos are locked out, and quite frankly, a greater diversity of Asian Americans are locked out than anybody's paying attention to. And a guy sits down next to me in a University of Mississippi booster shirt, the old one with the Confederate flag on it, and I order my drink. and he says to me, he says, so what do you do, right? About 10 minutes of the flight, and I said, well, I'm the national president and CEO of the NAACP. Right? I take a sip of my drink. So wait, he said, wow, that's fascinating. Tell me about affirmative action. Take a sip of my drink. I said, sir, well, affirmative action is supposed to be the hammer that destroys nepotism as the operating system of our country. He said, you can sign me up for that. He said, but what is it going to do for the boys in my family? And I said, well, I think, the girls, the women are probably pretty pleased with what affirmative action has done to our country the last 40 years. He says, no. He says, let me explain something. He said, I'm a bit of an exception in my family. My family came over here as part of the Georgia Penal Colony. He said, I was a great football player, so I got a scholarship to Ole Miss. The coach at Ole Miss got me a job at a big company in Memphis. That's why I'm so loyal to the football team, and that was the source of my success. He said, but the men in my family have been in and out of the Georgia penal system ever since there was a Georgia penal system. What is it going to do for the boys in my family? And I said, sir, well, I agree with President Obama and most of our universities that just as there's a race and a gender lens, there should also be a poverty lens. And in most of our universities, at least our major ones, there is one. If you're first generation college of any color, they're going to, open that door wider. And certainly in the Army, it's something that's paid attention to. But in the business world, we haven't quite figured out how to actually look at the distance somebody has traveled and actually translate that into something that we can hire on.